Welcome to Brain Cage, where we discuss BDSM, hypnosis, and the mind for all those exploring their fetishes and interests.
This is Puppet Master, your mentor for the podcast.
And this is Dracoso, your hypnotic guide.
Today we're going to be talking about priming and expectations. Priming being a subset of expectations in that it is the point at which you are getting the person or even yourself ready to do something. Where expectations is a more general thing that anyone can pick up at any point in their life. Often the stage show Hypnosis is a good example of that, and we'll be getting into her as much as we think is interesting, really.
Yes, and I think a little bit more for priming, especially in psychology. Priming is generally when you're trying to prepare someone to respond to a concept or an idea. You're trying to create an automatic response in some cases. For example, when I was a bit younger, and I know there is actually an example of this on YouTube with the Blue Man Group, where there's a video where you can have individuals doing one activity in front of you. This specific video had people dancing around, and they told the audience to pay attention to spotlights and how many times the dancers went in and out of it. While in the background, they had someone actually, and for anyone who's listening, this is a spoiler alert, in the background, there's actually a man in a penguin suit that sneaks by. And back when I was younger, we ran a study during while I was gaining my bachelor's degree to actually have individuals read about penguins before we show them the video. And we found people who were primed, quote unquote, who had actually read that, were more likely to notice the penguin in the background. And so priming is generally when you're trying to give someone a cue before something is going to happen to prepare them for it, or to make them in some ways be more expectant of that response. So the fun thing you can do with this, especially when you are in BDSM or when you're in hypnosis, an example is sitting down and discussing some of the things that they may experience, but also just talking about different aspects to it, different concepts to it. So priming someone who may not have ever done suspension where they're lifted off the ground, or who may not have been tied together and done bondage before, and felt their bodies restrained, discussing it and giving them past experiences can actually prime their mind so that they can experience this more fully. And in the concept of hypnosis, priming can be very impactful, such as if anyone's worked with imposition before, the concept of it's similar to the idea of the phantom limb syndrome, where you can feel or in a way create the sensation on yourself from what you see someone else doing or from what someone may describe to you, that you can prime someone to actually discuss with them ahead of time the idea that if I were to say that your body is capable of feeling different things, such as someone with a hand on your shoulder or someone patting the back of your hand, when you describe it, the mind has now been primed and is more receptive to the idea of that being described to them, because their mind has now created a connection that it may go back to and refer to, that it is now using to be more aware of what is happening.
I think a really cute example I have of priming is, well, one of my subs is currently exploring a potential new relationship and messing around with that person. They said pot instead of pet for pet, you know. And then they're like pot, and just went through with it, and the other person was like, it doesn't do anything. It's like, and then they turned around thinking about stuff that I've done to them and went, yeah, but my intention is to make you feel something whenever I say pot. So now you're going to feel it. Pot. And then they got all squirmy because they'd just been manipulated in a fun way. That's something funny, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think, the whole point is making a connection in the mind where if A happens, then B can be expected. I mean, you can connect the person consciously where you're describing a concept that the mind picks up and analyzes. So just like with that idea, you can tell someone straight to them, yeah, when I say pot, you're going to feel me, petting you or creating a new sensation for you. You can do subconscious priming, where it's more of a straightforward, where as you're talking, you're giving concepts, but then there are underlying pieces, such as you can describe to someone if they've been on a past experience where they felt relaxation or comfort. It somewhat trains the mind to connect ideas that you're doing now with past experiences that they may have relaxed to. In some of our previous podcasts, we have talked about the idea of asking questions such as, what do you find relaxing, or what kind of activities do you engage in that you find to be comforting and that you may feel more open to while you are doing it, and using those as a form of induction. And that's actually a form of subconscious priming in a sense, because you are now training the person's mind mentally to simply recall these ideas, and they are now subconsciously expecting to some degree to bring up those emotions and those reactions again to create the sensations. Or you could say subconsciously, unconsciously, whatever terminology you'd imagine, you're drawing up different connections to the session, and in a sense creating a base from what the person has already experienced and knows, and priming them. Somewhat like, well, I know priming, another idea or another example would be when people say they've primed a detonator, if they're going to do some kind of explosive work. And when you've primed it, it's pretty much putting it at the point where it is just ready to be activated and used. So the more you prime a person mentally in hypnosis, the more likely they're going to react and have a very strong, or at least stronger, response. And in BDSM, priming is very much about having the person feel like the activities or the pieces they're going into not only feel natural, but also align with their kinks, their fetishes, the fun that they have, and really building that connection out before you even get into the space.
Priming is very important for hypnosis because we are very much playing with the mind, and the mind, it will tend to react the way it thinks it's meant to. So if someone's watched a stage show, they might assume that they'll be non-responsive, that they won't remember anything, and if that's what they think will happen, that will happen. So talking to people and making sure that they have a good understanding of what is actually expected and what a person should be able to do, especially for someone that hasn't had much experience with it before. It'll even be better for them than someone that has been non-responsive for the year that they've been doing hypnosis for, because that's what they will expect, and it'll be hard to convince them otherwise. And then you can also work not just consciously with priming, but also subconsciously. If giving a person permission to remember the session isn't enough, then during the session you can give them permission then. And often that'll just be enough for them to allow themselves to remember. Now, of course, if they're particularly deep, there are other things where memory starts to become more like one would remember a dream, and so it can still be hazy dependent on the depth of the trance. But that's kind of outside of the scope of priming an expectation.
Yeah, and I know, especially when it comes down to someone's expectations, such as if they've seen a TV show where there was a scene with hypnosis, such as I know many people who I've talked with who have come into the hypnosis community have experienced cartoons, and that's been their sort of first experience, and that's sort of trained them as to what they think may happen. And it's sitting down and in a way helping to not simply direct what they may expect, but to make a person more aware of what else is possible. So like Puppet was saying, if they come in expecting that they are going to become completely nonverbal. They'll turn into a zombie or a drone, or they'll just become a malleable, maybe a doll or a puppet that may be controlled or interacted with.
Squishy puddle.
Yeah, they may become one of many, many different things, depending upon what they believe. It's about not simply telling them that's not how it works, but simply to talk with them and to not convince them that the way that one other person may see it. So I know one thing that I used to do when I was much younger was try to convince people of my perspective of hypnosis and how it worked. But rather, it's to make them more open-minded to the awareness that there are many different perspectives and awarenesses, and it's not just a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. There are possibilities where if someone's coming in and they believe that they could just be made to forget an entire session and whatever happened they have no access to, it's being aware that the mind can respond differently. It can remember things. In some cases, the mind, when it reaches a certain pattern that it follows, such as when you go to sit down and read a book, you may not remember as much as what happens, and so sometimes the brain will just follow different patterns based upon what it's experienced in the past as well. So not only is it belief, which is a very big, definitely for hypnosis, it's a very big influencer as to what the mind may be willing to connect to at first and what it is expecting, but it also comes back to a person's brain has a separate chemistry, such as a very common concept across the world is alcohol and being aware of how that impacts the mind. And it can have an impact based upon genetics. It can have an impact based upon how the mind works and how it's wired. It may even have an impact based upon just diet is one very common aspect. And so hypnosis is very, very similar in the concept that there are a lot of factors that may impact how a person's mind may respond during a session and how they may work, such as, I know as we get into the idea of what to expect from hypnosis and how a person's mind may pick it up, we've discussed the idea of talking and trying to get more of a conscious response as to what the person may experience, but someone who may not have done hypnosis as often may have responses that they themselves may not know may occur. And so having expectations of what else could happen during a session is very important. For example, I've worked with a lot of different individuals who, as you've probably seen from different shows, if you've reviewed different things or that you've experienced or even seen other people do hypnosis, much of the time people may be verbal while they are hypnotized. They will respond to questions, they will give cues or different pieces of information, but in some cases I've worked with individuals who either have difficulty responding during hypnosis, find it interrupts the flow or the pattern or even just their ability to relax during hypnosis, or I've even worked with people who have gone completely nonverbal. They will not respond, they will take in information and respond to it when they are awake, but when they are under, they have relaxed to the point where either they believe they can't respond, or their brain may simply have gone to a point that when they relax or when they become comfortable or in a sense allow themselves to disengage enough of the activity in their brain, they are no longer able to or no longer interested or connected to the part of their brain that will respond. And understanding what to do or how this may change the concept, especially ahead of time, is very important, and it's good to consider what you might do, and it may even help you during sessions where someone who is verbal may benefit from.
And there are also tropes that can be actually quite beneficial for you as a artist. Subjects that watch files and they usually have spirals or something visual for you to focus on. Their expectation is the spiral will help them get them under, and so it will. Giving a command and clicking a finger, that's a very big trope from stage shows. But it works because they expect it. It's also quite commanding. So in BDSM, it can be a thing that someone might be trained and conditioned with as well. Clickers are a thing that comes with training. Training and conditioning are definitely forms of priming.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, whether it is in hypnosis or in BDSM, priming can be amazing, honestly. I think my favorite form of priming, and I use this too with some of my subs that I explore with, a lot of people from the older generations may remember it, but it's the Jaws theme song. That is a huge, huge primer, because when you hear that, your brain begins to pick up on this tense air, and you begin to get ready to dive into something that may be more dangerous, maybe more exciting. But yeah, I think with the idea of priming, it works for both the subject and the hypnotist. It works for the submissive and the dominant. Priming can be used in both directions. And I think that's a big thing to keep in mind, especially because from the side of the submissive, the subject, you can prime the dominant or the hypnotist to actually respond in certain ways. Such as I've known a subject who loved to come and be a bit of a tease, be a bit of a brat, and it primes me to be more dominant. It primes me to be more responsive, and in a way, while it might be more of a response where they're being bratty, and so I'm going to respond to them, it's in its own sense, it is a priming because they are now acting in a way that's going to cause you to want to be more dominant. In some ways, it's a reaction, but in many ways, you can prime them to where you could be more bratty, and if you have a scene that's planned for later that day, later that night, it may turn into a more intense scene because now they've been primed or they've been given this sort of connection strengthener that's going to make them want to act in a certain way. And especially when it comes to BDSM, priming is extremely important because you're trying to bring the person's mind into a state or a specific way to respond to what you're going to do. In a sense, there's rapport building where you feel more comfortable with one another, and then there's priming where if you have something specific laid out or ready, I guess you could say there's a teasing form of priming that goes on quite often in BDSM, even in normal. And for people who may not know this concept or this idea, it's known as vanilla. It's when it's outside of kinky, when it's outside of certain having an additional kink or a point. It's more just, enjoying more of a sexual activity that you can still see priming quite frequently. People teasing each other, saying that they're going to have a surprise for them when they play tonight. That's a form of priming because it makes the mind more receptive and open to an idea related to the activity. And so...
Even foreplay.
Oh, yeah. Foreplay can be a very big sense of priming, mentally as well as emotionally and physically. And really exploring how you can put together this preset, this idea of how the mind wants to work. It can really impact what is expected to happen during the session, or at least making them more receptive to how much they will expect and experience what happens.
I think an example I have of very kinky priming that I wasn't even a part of was have a sub. They had a very strong ability to come on command. And there's a lot of files out there, air quotes, hands-free orgasm files. And when they showed me files that they used to listen to, most of them were that. And they had primed themselves by watching them before. And we've since incorporated it into the brainwashing I'm doing on them. So it's very strong now. But you can do so much with priming. It's more than just getting people ready for something. It can also enable things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, a very good example of helping someone to explore something that they may not have done before is if they're nervous or they're worried, connecting it to past memories or past ideas that may be similar. For example, I knew a friend of mine who was worried about going on a roller coaster ride because he was actually pretty anxious about whether or not he'd fall out or if it was dangerous and so on. And it's a very common idea to be worried that they are unsafe, as there is quite a bit of, well, I can't say there's risk. I'll say there is a very exhilarating and very powerful experience of being on a roller coaster. And with that, they pretty much primed him to relax a bit more by just describing the fact that he has been to very intense experiences. He has experienced things. I mean, in some cases, it may not be directly connected, where they try to talk about intense movies where he'd seen it, or they had him watch a video of a roller coaster ride and helped him to see it. And in a sense, they tried to desensitize him, but they also tried to prime him where his mind would understand more of what would happen. And once he got there, it was more receptive to the steps, the follow through, the pattern, and it created this expectation. But I think a very, very simple form that a lot of people can connect with is, if you ever heard from a friend about a TV show, about an event, about things, and they said, this is going to be amazing, or, expect this to be very intense. That's a form of priming that we've probably all experienced, where we can feel what our friends have told us is now creating an expectation in us. And when it comes to certain activities, especially, expectations can have a very big impact, not only on how a person will respond, such as if their expectations are completely different from what they're expecting, or from what actually happens, they may end up having a lesser response or possibly a negative response. So building out expectations for, if say you're going to, I think one actually great example, very personal one, was I went to an event once where I was actually caned. And it was just sort of, it was funny because when people hear that, it's that, oh, you were caned, that sounds very intense, it sounds scary. In all honesty, I had a full discussion during the caning with the person who was doing it about the history of caning. And that sounds very strange. It sounds like I wasn't really focused, but in all honesty, the person who had caned me, had discussed with me about what to expect, what it may be like, and had also sat down and just talked with me about things I'd experienced in the past, such as for caning. He asked me if I'd ever had a shiatsu massage. If I said that wrong, I apologize. But he pretty much connected my mind with other experiences where I'd be in the same position, or I would have felt similar interactions, and that all I'd really need to do is relax. And he primed me by just giving me another mentality, which is when I'd relax and read a book and just be at ease laying on my stomach, I could just calm my body down enough that even when there were sore, tense moments, that I would be comfortable. And it created a very relaxed experience, enjoyable, and I was able to experience it as I wanted to know what it was like to be caned. Again, something not a lot of people might say or admit in some ways, but it is a very natural, in a sense, it's a very natural experience, since it's just a physical interaction at a different perspective than you might normally experience. And talking with it and figuring out ahead of time actually relaxed me a lot, enough that we just had a full conversation during it, and I was able to experience it just as fully as someone else. At least from what he said, I would respond very similarly, outside of people who find it as a kink, since I could definitely say I was not enjoying it as much as the next person that came on.
There are also times when you don't want to prime people. Take the example of a scare house at a theme park, where you go in and people jump out and scare you in creepy costumes and stuff. If you know all the rules, that they're not allowed to touch you and the other things that they have to follow, it becomes a lot less scary. Now, moving that to BDSM, there are times when you want to create tension. There are times when you want them to be scared if negotiated. And priming, you can use it to create tension in some ways, but other things you might want to omit, as long as it's within the boundaries of the limits that are known. CNC, I find a lot of the time it can be about not being able to know what's going to happen. For some people, it's the complete loss of control. But for other people, it's the unexpected. And it's just a case of working out when priming will be beneficial and when it won't. And just being clever about it, I think.
True. I think just for anyone who may not know the concept, CNC is consensual non-consent. Long and the short for this is it's communicating ahead of time for activities a person may not normally engage in comfortably by choice. And it may be activities that a part of the excitement and the enjoyment is not having control or not having the ability to have a say during a scene, but instead discussing ahead of time what is expected and what can and can't happen, so that a person may be able to experience something they normally wouldn't in that level of excitement. So having a scene like Puppet Master was saying, where the person feels like they can be safe, and I know one example of this was I built out for a sub that I worked with, or a subject, that they, during the scene, until they absolutely needed it, their safe word would be temporarily subdued, was the word they love to use. And they wanted it so that the scene would be as real as possible, but that at any time that they felt they needed to stop, whether it was because of a situation coming up or because there was an emergency, that their safe word would always be there and available. And I actually trained them to subconsciously respond, just in case if there was any issue, to subconsciously respond to automatically say that safe word if their body or their mind reached a point where they no longer felt that they could, function or feel safe, or there was an issue. And so they would use that trigger automatically if they were unsafe. We, of course, built up over a long period of time that they would be able to use it subconsciously. We tested it, made sure everything was in order, but for expectations, some people want the scene to be as real as possible and feel like they can enjoy something. But at the same time, it's about, in a way, there's a certain level of support where it could go a little overboard or go in the wrong direction, such as with a scare house. If you try to prime someone to be less scared, it may impact the experience or the session or the scene that you're trying to have. Such as I know in BDSM, if someone was to be going in and enjoying, say, being bound up and blindfolded and feel scary, and feel like, not feel scary, but to feel like they are scared, and actually feel this sense of a loss of control. And I knew one person who would, I think they learned very quickly, they would tie someone up and then they would teach them. There was a method very quickly that if they moved in a certain way, it would undo the ropes. And they would teach people when they first started tying them up that you could do this. Of course, it only took about 10 seconds to teach them. And even in that sense, he was still within arm's reach where he could just do it himself in a half second to just immediately relieve the ropes in case something happened. But for some people, as he taught them how to get out of it from the start, in case there was a situation that came up, pretty much they would feel less controlled. They would feel primed now that they would be more easily able to take control of the scene themselves. And for some people who would be very active mentally during the scenes rather than letting themselves become fully engaged for different reasons, they would be thinking about how they could just get free the whole time. And so for some cases, he would have situations where he would have a very simple, quick teaching where he would show them how they could move their body without telling them what it was for, and tell them it was a position or a certain thing. So they would train them to be ready to get out, but without telling them what it was for. And the moment they would get anxious, or if there was an issue that would come up, he could now use that as a form of priming them to respond without dulling the impact of the anxiety. And so I think knowing and expecting what could happen and how this may impact a session, especially, and how a person sees what may occur, is very, very important to keep in mind. That if you are careful, but also you find enjoyable ways to just build out that expectation, a person can quite enjoy the session, and they can quite enjoy just the surprises that their own mind can build out from the connections that you prime in.
And there are different ways to prime people dependent on the ways that you're playing. Some people just play via text. voice, video, and of course in person. And there'll be different methods that you can use for each of these. And a lot of crossover, of course. Anything that you can do in voice, you can also do in video and in person.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start off with the most limited one, text. Dracoso, do you want to start off with this?
Sure. So, quite often, people who are not comfortable with, say, doing voice and being heard, or doing video where they might be seen, some people will go to explore in text. And some people know it as role playing for a base. I know a lot of people who do role playing online, they'll play characters, they'll describe different aspects. And when it comes down to it, it is in some ways the most disconnected, I could say, and maybe a little bit of a harsh word for it, but it is the most difficult in some cases to get someone engaged, because there is less that is able to be picked up on and worked with. So for text, you are trying to build out ideas and sensations, and you're trying to build expectations on what may be felt or what may occur. And due to the fact that text is at a specific pace, in a lot of ways text is much slower for most people than simply speaking and using voice. I know some people who have a very good ability to dictate and to be able to type out other people's words as they speak, such as court reporters and people who may need to keep track of different discussions at meetings. But text, in a way, has a very different pace. It may be hard as well to pick up the exact intention of a person's words, simply because there isn't an emotion or a specific point behind it. But text can actually use its own form of priming, simply using certain patterns in the words, such as if you're going to work with hypnosis or if you're going to roleplay BDSM through text. One of the biggest aspects to consider really is how their mind picks up information and how well they can stay engaged. I've known individuals who prefer long sections of text to read so that they're engaged consistently and their mind is picking up different aspects. And so what they're expecting is there to be more information at each point, versus some people who I've known prefer there just to be short pieces of information. They prefer quick, say 5 to 10 word, or even 2 to 3 word sentences that catch their mind and get them engaged so that they are reading consistently and picking up and building, kind of like a Lego building set rather than sort of a larger connector piece. And because of that, you can prime based upon different ideas. I think one fun idea that I had with someone when I did hypnosis who worked with more short sentences would be that I would type to them normally, give them sort of a moderate to long sentence, which is very, very vague. It's a very vague idea. For me, a medium to long sentence would be 10 to 30 words. So just a general sentence like telling them that it might be normal for them to relax and feel at ease when they do hypnosis. That would be a long sentence. If they find that their mind at the time was connecting with 1 to 3 sentence words, in the middle, I could just say, like a nap, and toss that in. And that's just a quick primer. That actually gets the mind connected to think on what a nap is like. And now their mind has put that in consciously and subconsciously, is connected, where consciously they're thinking of what a nap is like, and subconsciously they pick up on the emotion, the feeling of relaxation, and just talking with people, I guess, figuring out their patterns and what they find comforting and relaxing. Text requires quite a bit more communication to understand how words have an impact on their mind. And it may be the most difficult to understand because, like I said, there's less emotion connected to the words that you can pick up naturally, and there requires more effort to some degree to get across certain ideas or concepts, such as if you were to describe how it feels to be held by someone you care about. When you speak with someone and you tell them and you describe it, it has a lot more emotion and feeling and personal meaning behind it than if you are typing in text. I mean, some people can pick up on that very easily and may have a connection through text, but
I think emotion is the wrong word there. I think communication is what you mean. There's less communication because emotion is very personal.
I actually do use the word emotion for this because of the fact that emotion can be very easily expressed through words. Some people may not pick up on hearing it verbally as much as in text. It's very true. I use it because emotion is something that we do express through all forms of communication. It may be harder to pick up on text because when you read text, you may pick it up from your perspective and what you imagine they are saying. So you can read something multiple different ways, and when it's heard, you can still take it more ways, but if someone is angry, it comes across a bit more clearly in voice just because there's more, I guess there's more signals to hear from it.
Basically, you're talking about emotion as a subset of communication rather than emotion as its own umbrella term.
Right, I'm thinking of emotion as sort of an indicator
Right.
to how you would pick up on what the person is saying. So if someone talks about something and they may be uncomfortable and they may try to give, say through text, if you're just texting with one another, you may not pick up at first that that person is uncomfortable. And so it's good to understand a bit more about the person's mind and patterns. Text may require more in-depth connection communication before you can fully confirm whether or not something is actually connecting in the way that you believe it would be.
So, a way I would prime someone if I was using text is, and this is for hypnosis, if you start off very early on saying, throughout this, you'll have your hand on the mouse and you'll be scrolling down as I type. It depends if it will automatically scroll or not. But let's assume for this example that it won't. Or it could just be, if it's a block of text, then this example is actually pretty good. And what you've done there is you've taken out the chance that they're going to go completely limp and unable to follow what's happening by priming them to do what you're expecting them to do. Because if they reach a point where they can't continue, it's just going to take them out of it. That's my tip for text-based stuff. Particularly if it's a written thing, a longer thing that'll go over multiple pages.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been primed just by reading movie descriptions as to what we believe the movie may be about. And that puts in our mind an idea of what we're expecting, which may or not be fully accurate. And I think that along with text, people begin to use sort of visual cues or visual information such as spirals, or I've known some people who use spirals that are different visuals such as images of what they would imagine becoming.
You can't use spirals with... I mean, you can have GIFs with spirals that have text in them, but you can't use spirals at the same time as text, because if you tell someone to concentrate on the spiral, when they scroll down, eventually it's no longer going to be there.
It's true, but then I've also known, and I've explored this a little bit myself, it is possible to send a spiral to someone, have them relax and enjoy it for a few minutes, and have it create an impact, create something of an opening where the mind is experiencing and exploring those words and having them influence how they may think and feel for a temporary time, and then having them come back and talking with them. But yes, it's creating this sort of disconnect between the spiral and your text words. So a lot of the time using visuals such as watching a spiral that may have words and may have different things in it is a focus point that may pull away from your words and bring them back. It may be something of a back and forth pull, where now they are trying to focus on one thing and then focusing on you. And so understanding that if you want to use visuals, especially different ideas, it's much more streamlined or much more effective if you use voice, which I think is the next point we should talk on. And the idea of using a spiral can be effective, but it's more effective when you have a singular focus or when you have focuses that complement one another rather than obstruct one another.
And a spiral's only effective when they think it's going to be effective. Like, a spiral doesn't actually do much to a person's mind. It gives them a single point to focus on, which can be good for meditative reasons, which is a similar mindset to being hypnotized if you're trying to influence yourself. It's another topic.
Well, yeah, and I think on a short point on that, it also depends how you present it. Such as, I've known for people I've explored with in the past, I've discussed whether or not they find faster or slower spirals work for them because the mind may actually focus on different patterns. But sort of a short version is, since I know this is another topic we could probably talk on.
That's NLP. It's like, does the faster one or the slower one work for you? And you basically said, one of them will work for you, without needing to say that.
To some degree, that's very true. I would say it's also a form of priming because now you're having their own mind state whether or not they believe that a faster or slower spiral will work, or maybe a more or less complex spiral might work. Working with the different forms of hypnosis, especially as you go from text into voice and some more of the, I guess you could say, the more active to some degree, as text can have pauses or have little work points where the person may need to be more engaged in order for it to work. Voice is where you begin priming more directly. The emotion is there, having yourself sound and perhaps even feel more relaxed and comfortable is a very big influence on how comfortable and how much the person may expect to feel relaxed themselves. Such as if a person came in extremely nervous and shaking about hypnotizing someone, that person may pick up on that and hear it in your voice and may not become as relaxed or may become more concerned for the other person. So with voice, especially if you're coming in to communicate, to speak with someone, just like what we're doing now, I'd say in a sense, this wouldn't be considered full, hypnosis. This wouldn't be a hypnosis session what we're doing, but this is voice. You can pick up on our emotions, you can pick up on when we're having fun, and to some degree, even as we've been talking across this entire podcast, there have been moments where your mind may have been primed towards multiple different things, such as when I've mentioned the Jaws theme song, you may have felt a bit more tense or anxious if you have memories that came from that. As we talked about, other friends who have said something's going to be great or something will be, tough to deal with, it primes you to be ready to experience those kinds of activities. So as you work with voice, it becomes more, in some senses, it becomes more in general intimate. But at the same time, it also creates more forms of communication that you can prime the person through and create expectations as to what might happen.
And again, to link back to what I said with text, telling them that you will be talking with them throughout the session will tend to be enough to get that feedback that can be very important. Voice is something I tend to do more than anything else because I've got my 3 subs are all over the world, basically, and I love them to bits. The more options there are to communicate with a person, maybe the less you actually need to focus on priming them, because you're able to communicate more and more on the go, and then you create that intimate connection, as we talk about in our last podcast, that allows expectation. I suppose it's not a lack of priming actually, but more of priming on the go as you read what's expected from the other person.
Right, and I would say, just to build on that idea, is I believe sort of as you work up from text to voice to video to even in person, I feel that because as it becomes more intimate in many aspects, priming will be more effective. So you may not need it as much in the sense of, whether or not you use it, but you may not need to do as much priming to have the same effect. And so continuing and priming as much as you would in voice as you would in text, you may see that the impact will be even stronger, because priming generally comes from the idea that you can connect with a specific idea. I think the one I gave at the very starting of this was the idea of being aware of a person in a penguin suit in the background, just by priming them on the idea of reading a story about penguins. And it was a very general priming. It was a text form that connected them, and we found it did have some impact, but it wasn't a very large impact. And we found that by talking about it, and I think by reading it, in some sense, it takes you a step away from a person saying it, and then when someone says it, it becomes more of a social priming as well as a mental priming, where you are hearing something, and so you are holding a value because someone nearby may, and you may need to respond to that later. So it creates more of a personal piece that they take in. So as you get up into voice, it's more of a response to what the person is saying and how they're saying it, and the information you're provided. And so it takes less time to sort of put those pieces together, and less effort to understand where the direction may be going with it for their mind to create a connection.
And thinking back, the most intimate moments I've had have definitely been in person. And although I can't connect it to the ways that we were primed to feel that way, I think now that I know more about it, I would be able to see it happening more.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, for video, I think the biggest thing that really comes down to the differences between, say, voice and video are that you can visually see each other, you can respond to how they're responding. It's kind of like, and I think a very good example of this is if you're on voice with someone, just voice, and they get distracted by something, you may not know. You may not pick up on it. It may not be something that you'd be aware of, but if you are doing video, you can see them getting distracted by something. And it makes a big impact on what you're expecting and what they may be expecting. And so one big thing I can say, and it really gives more information, priming comes down to what your mind connects to and then holds on to what it's expecting. So usually in many cases of priming, it would be something you've primed to do that is either very specific, such as if a friend says, there's an event that's going to be amazing. That's a priming that your mind will now connect to that event specifically. But if it's, say, more general, where if you're talking with someone about what it's like to feel relaxed, and then you don't do a session or you don't do a kink scene within a reasonable amount of time, so let's say within a couple of days, their mind may not still connect to that idea. So priming, in a sense, can wear off. And with video, seeing them and having, let's say if the person becomes distracted and you aren't aware, your mind may not pick up on that idea, but their mind may now have changed how primed it is, quote unquote, versus if you were watching them and you saw it, it now primes you to be aware that there might have been a shift. So you may need to react to it. And I think going back to Puppet, your idea of being in person, I think the interesting thing is that there's more...
My original idea of being in person.
It's your idea. Sorry, the idea that you originally brought up of when you were in person. There's a lot that actually...
I'll take credit.
Right? There's a lot of ideas that come from being in person, such as priming that occurs very straightforward, that is, well, automatic.
Yeah, it's automatic, and you can see if they're following your eyes, your mouth, or your hand. If they're following your hand, you can just lower it as you're talking with them, which can just be this amazing way to connect. And there's so much more communication you can do when you can see the entire person, the full body language, where their attention is, because if they're looking at a screen, it can be hard to tell. And being able to put all of that together, it can be so easy to mess with the person.
There's a lot of natural priming that goes on, such as when you're in person with someone, your mind begins to pick up on connections of how do I act socially that is appropriate? How do I interact with people around me that really connects with what is going on? And so understanding that there is a lot of activity, there's a lot of response, there's a lot of sort of retrieval of how you act and how you react. And there's a lot of natural priming that comes in where when you first come into the room, you may see people doing things and you start forming expectations as to what might happen, such as if you see people doing hypnosis sessions when you enter into a scene, your mind may be primed now to expect, oh, well, I may be hypnotized, which makes it now more open and receptive to experiencing it. Or if that's something that the person wouldn't want, which, so people get an idea with priming, there can also be a point where someone's uncomfortable or against an idea. Priming can actually push them away from being receptive because now they are expecting something that may not want to be happen comes into play. And I think this just sort of shows across these steps. It's not really a spectrum, but it's just different levels of understanding with how priming or how expectations may work with text to voice to video, and then all the way up to being in person. Being in person, there's far more communication that happens non-verbally, and there's far more interaction that happens just naturally that doesn't need to be outlined, such as just speaking and describing things can have far more meaning than if it's just in text, because a person's mind tries to fill in the gaps where they may be missing aspects. The less it needs to do that, the more easily the mind can pick up on things. And I think very much so people right now, and probably into the future, who are experiencing the current situation can understand that being in person with someone is very, very different than just being on voice or on video and seeing one another. And it has a very big impact on how well you can connect and expect things from that person. And I think the other thing I do want to talk on especially is to understand expectations in a scene and how things may play out for both hypnosis and BDSM. So for expectations, especially when you are the subject or the hypnotist, submissive, dominant, there's a lot of different things that can happen that one, a person may be not aware of when they first do the activities, or two, that may happen and you need to learn about as you work with them. For example, a person I've worked with in the past when I did hypnosis, they'd be relaxing, we were at an event, and as I was relaxing them down, they went completely limp and almost fell out of their chair. For some people who do hypnosis, their body will relax to the point that they will physically calm down and relieve all tension in their body and go limp. For some people, they will tense up and may find it be stressful to physically tense up but mentally relax. I've had one person who would roll around when they relaxed because whenever they would sleep, they'd be very, very mobile. And so in this, they started off in a very comfortable position and they moved a bit into a less comfortable position without being aware of it and woke up very sore on their legs. And so understanding that a person may be more mobile, they may be more likely to go limp and even fall if they're standing, it's good to be aware of what may happen for them physically. I think we mentioned earlier the idea of them being verbal versus non-verbal, the idea that they may not speak or respond, and understanding how to work with that and how to respond to that, especially since I knew one person who was completely non-verbal. They did not respond when I asked questions. They would not, at least while they were in hypnosis. And it's very important to understand, even in BDSM, I've known one case where an individual would be tied up and they would be so exhilarated, had so much adrenaline pumping through them, that they could only speak in short bursts. And so coming to understand the person you work with and what may come out of it is a very big point to be aware of, that there may be aspects you may not really expect that'll come from the start, but working with it and working around it to find ways that they feel comfortable to answer to these points of how they work, can create a far more effective system, such as for the person who only spoke in short bursts, they did a lot of discussion beforehand to figure out everything they wanted to do, and then during the scene they used those short bursts as a way to actually exemplify just how helpless they were by simply asking questions, and the answers they gave, like they were asked for a complex answer, they'd only give a short one, and then the dominatrix would actually tease them about the fact that they were so helpless they could barely even speak.
Yeah. Sounds fun. But round up, I want to say that it's been really nice coming back to this topic from our very first podcast, communication, and I hope that people can see how much utility that they can get out of priming and expectation, because there's so much that you can do with it that can make conditioning, hypnosis, brainwashing, training so much more effective and thus better and more fun, exciting.
More sexy.
Sexy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd say, I think the final point that I'd want to touch on especially is a concept in our community that comes down to memory. And I know that we should talk quite a bit more about memory play in the future, but the idea of whether or not someone can remember what happens during a scene. It's a very sexy concept. It's the idea of, can I make them do things and forget it, or make them think otherwise as to why something is happening, and show them even less control because now their memory works for me, quote unquote. One expectation, especially for hypnosis, this can range from one end where it is they remember everything and they have difficulty not remembering, and to the other end where someone is unable to remember and they have difficulty even trying to remember. And like we've mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things you can do to build it out. One example for me is when I've had people who feel that they can't remember themselves. They personally feel that their mind is unable to connect to it. And again, this may be due to multiple things, whether or not their mind believes that it can, or whether or not, let's say that they have a part of their brain that when they relax enough, it stops trying to monitor what happens as much and keep memory intact. Instead, it just experiences and enjoys. For some people who have wanted to remember and feel that they can't, I've created something such as a string that is attached to their pinky and goes all the way back up to the surface, if that's how they imagine sort of depth. And that as they go down, the string will pick up pieces that connect to it so that when they awaken, they can rebuild the memory, they can put the whole back together. And for some people who have trouble trying to forget and really don't want to remember what happens while under, they like the surprise or the enjoyment, I would try to create something that aligns with how their mind works. Just like with the string, because it's now something of an external control, their mind picks it up as sort of a more concrete idea that is not just their mind trying to remember, but an assistant that comes along. For someone who has trouble forgetting, you can build out ideas based on how they imagine the mind works. So if they imagine that their memory is like a film playing through different shots, playing through different views, and that it's a movie, you could literally work with that concept and create the idea that maybe the screen has gone dark and they've covered the light bringing it out. It's still going on in the background, but now they are not watching it or viewing it, so their mind doesn't have access to it. Or even changing the different images on the movie recorder as they could do editing. There's a lot of direct points. Another one would be someone I worked with used to imagine that their memories were like a stream, a river that would flow through, and that they would imagine that if there was some way to redirect parts of the river, their mind and their memory would now change to where they would not remember certain things that happened during it, such as I could have them forget triggers. Or, for one example, which I'll go into probably in more detail if we do talk on memory play in the future, is that I would make them believe, they would forget that either of us had said something when the trigger went off, and that they would believe that the trigger, what they were doing to respond to it or obey it, was their own idea. It was their own concept, and that I would make them remember later on that it hadn't been, and their mind now has this difference in view. And by creating concepts of, in a sense, priming, but also to take what they expect and how they expect it to work, and working with that more directly, you're able to create a far more effective method where their mind will actually be able to change or to focus. And I think the big concept of memory versus not memory, or not being able to remember during a session, is really simply the idea that a person is going to remember something or not based upon whether or not their mind has a connection to remember or not remember. And sometimes their mind naturally builds it so that it doesn't have a connection, and sometimes it naturally builds it to have a connection. So understanding that the person you're working with may have a mentality that does not go in one direction or another, but to build out with what's there and to help to change it based on what they're comfortable with.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's topic.
If you've enjoyed this, you can support us at patreon.com/braincage. You can also join us over on Discord at Fetlandia and talk with us directly.
Links for both are listed in the description.
Thanks again for listening, and take care.